Rena, I'll let you take roll call and officially start.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christy, for that very nice reminder there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do roll call. When I call your name, please voice that you are present, if you are. All right, Brenna Sullivan with the Lake County Farm Bureau.
Here, good morning.
Good morning, Brenna. Pat Scully with Scully Packing Company.
Here.
Hi, Pat.
Good morning.
David Wise with Bella Vista Farming Company.
Good morning, I'm here.
Good morning, David. Kyle Reams with Kelseyville Unified School District.
Here.
Hi, Kyle. Sarah Ryan, Big Valley Band of Pomo Indians, and she did report that she will be trickling in late, but I do not see her on the call right now. Okay. And then Scott Horning with Lake County Special Districts.
I'm here.
Hi, Scott. Good morning.
Hey.
Valerie Nixon with Lake County Land Trust.
I'm here.
Good morning, Val.
Good morning.
Sky Hoyt, groundwater well owner.
Here.
Good morning, Sky. And then Marina Delajanis, Lake County Watershed Protection District. I am present. All right, so let's go ahead and review and approve October 8, 2021 meeting minutes. Did all GSPAC members have an opportunity to review that meeting summary?
Yeah.
Right.
And Marina, why everybody's just kind of giving their final thoughts on that, I do want to direct that that is available on the website too, always, for people to read the meeting summary from all of our meetings, as well as the recordings that go with them.
And I will put that in the chat. Peter Windrum, I'm realizing I did not call on Peter Windrum. Peter Windrum with the Chi Council.
Here.
Hi, Peter. Good morning. Sorry about that.
You saved me a chat. I was just sending to you.
All right. So if everyone has had an opportunity to review the meeting summary minutes, I'm looking for a motion to approve and then a second.
I'll move. David Weiss.
Thank you, David. And then can I get a second?
I'll second.
All right. Thank you, Peter. All right. So the minutes have been approved and seconded. So we're going to go ahead and I just want to do a very, very brief update on our groundwater report of groundwater conditions and drought related information. So I do know that Ibrahim, Eddie, and Will have some additional information to elaborate a little bit more on this, but I just want to remind folks, wondering if we can, oh, perfect. Thank you so much. So here is the most recent summary from the My Dry Well reporting. Again, this is a DWR platform where folks have the opportunity to submit these reports. We are currently at 29 reports as of this morning. And just a disclaimer, we have not had the chance to go out and verify this. I've not received confirmation from the state that these reports are verified. These reports are self-submitted from folks that either have an understanding of dry wells or are themselves experiencing dry wells throughout the county. We at Water Resources have not received any more additional reports, but I just want to encourage people that anything as it relates to drought, that they will go before the board. So for example, any sort of water haulers ordinances that I know the Board of Supervisors working on, the drought task force that they just recently created, which is a board appointed discussion, all that will be going before the board. So I just encourage folks to keep an eye out for those Board of Supervisors agendas. I will make sure that if I have anything coming down the radar that I see on my radar, I can go ahead and send that and share that with folks. If that's of interest, I'm more than happy to do just that. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Ibrahim and Eddie for update on drought or RMS wells.
Ibrahim, you want to take this?
Sure. So William and team has been out collecting the fall measurement throughout the county, and we kind of highlighted here some of the results of the monitoring they've shown for these RMS well for the fall. We have just the disclaimer: one well. This well here in the northwest do not have a fall measurement yet. I think it's monitored by DWR, and the results are not available yet. But for all the other 6, for the other 5, we have the fall measurement. So let me see if I can use my pen here. So this is the northeast well, and the northwest well, we see this is the fall measurement, and it's about 43 feet below ground surface, and it's kind of pretty low compared to the last 10 years or so, or 15 years. It's actually as low as would have been observed in the deep droughts of the 1990s, 76, 75, 76, and then a little bit better than what had been observed way back in 1965. One thing to caution too is one of the challenges with the fall measurement here is this might not be really indicative of a static groundwater elevation. What we mean by that might be the well has been running, and so the groundwater elevation has dropped, or the well has just been turned off and the well has not fully recovered to the actual level in the basin. At any rate, this is kind of what we see here in the northwest quadrant. The good news is it's if you look at the green line here, this is represent where 5% of the wells are, basically the shallowest 5% of the domestic wells. And so even this level is way higher than the most of the wells in this quadrant. And so we should expect little impact to groundwater well owners in this area. Again, based on the information we have from DWR, and this is one of the challenges we keep repeating is all of the data we have here on domestic well depth is based on driller wells report submitted to DWR as well completion report. Many years ago, we haven't had any chance to go out and verify those. In the east central, we're very close to Kelseyville. Again, the groundwater elevation in the fall is at this level here, you can see, and those are a little bit is lower than the last few years, but still higher than what has been observed in the last set of droughts, 2014 and 2015, as bad as what has been observed in the 90s and the early 2000s. Here in this area where we see probably some of the reports about dry wells, the green line again represent the shallowest 5% of the wells, domestic wells, and those are about 25 feet deep. Again, we don't have so 5% of the 60 wells we have here, so it's about 3 wells in this area. So there are about 3 wells in this area that might be 25 feet or lower. Again, caveat is we're not sure if this is the static groundwater elevation or because the pumping itself was running and just being shut off. And then based on the report we see from DWR also in the county, it's a side note, most of the well that's been impacted, we see them as very shallow wells, like 10 feet, 12 feet, 15 feet. Some of them are deeper, but there's quite a few shallow wells. Going on to the north, close to the quadrant or the section close to the lake, the groundwater elevation in the fall looks pretty high. It actually looks pretty stable, like the last few years, so there is no big change. Again, all the levels in the fall is higher than the shallowest groundwater well in that section. In the west central, this part of the basin, groundwater elevation is much higher than what has been, it's lower than what has been observed in the last 10 or 15 years, but higher than what has been observed historically. And again, they're above the shallowest domestic wells in the region, so we should be in pretty good shape. In the southwest quadrant in this area, the RMS well again shows groundwater elevation levels are consistent with what we have seen in the past 10 years. So basically no clear evidence of a drought impacts here. And then again, that level is much higher than the average domestic wells or the shallow domestic well. Within this area, domestic wells and production wells is fairly deep. As you can see, they're probably around 105. The shallowest is about 100 feet deep. So that's all I have. William?
I just want to note from the chat, can you explain real quick, Ibrahim, those three colored lines, just so everybody understands what they mean?
Yeah, so the three colored line here are, this is the shallowest 5% of the domestic wells, the shallowest 10% of domestic wells, and this is the shallowest 20% of the domestic wells. So based on the reports that we had from DWR about the well completion reports, we broke the wells into quadrants, and then we kind of did a summary statistics. So there is, in this quadrant, there is about 23 domestic wells. And then for those 23 domestic wells, again, per the state record, 5% of them are shallower than 105 feet. 10% is shallower than 143 feet, and then 20% is shallower than 190 feet. So that's what these three lines means, and then they're different. You can see the wells are deeper in the south and a little bit shallower in this region here, around Kelseyville.
And William, before you dive into the AEM or fly into the AEM portion of this, I just want to note that Sarah said that not all wells are in DWR's record, so it's impossible to know the accurate exact number of wells. Yep. And then Bethany had a quick question about, is there any explanation for why you aren't seeing low groundwater levels given the drought?
I'm not sure. Maybe it's related to, I mean, we're seeing some low groundwater levels in this area, but in general, when you look at the historical trend in the basin itself, the basin does a fairly good job of recovering each year based on the spring. If it is wet or dry, it recovers fairly well, and then the use in the drought, it's kind of we don't see a big change in use. And so as long as we get a wet winter, basically the basin reset, and then the drought that's kind of affecting other part of the state is tied to snow melt, the reservoir carryover storage, and all of these factors. Here you have a much more contained basin, and so as long as you get a pretty wet winter, your basin basically reset and start basically with the spring level fairly full. I mean, again, we started this year with a lower spring. I mean, you look at this orange dot. You started with a fairly low spring, and so the worry is if we have another wet year, another dry year, sorry, going backward. If we get another dry year, this spring level might not recover as high as we hope for. So I think we just pray for the rain, to get a little bit more rain so the groundwater spring will recover. So that was a long explanation.
Okay. Sarah, did you have a quick question?
Yeah, is it possible to just give a brief description of how the well levels are measured? And
yeah, I can do that.
Tommy's doing it, but yeah, if you can explain that, thanks.
So we do sampling monthly and then biannually, and I just want to note that even monthly we've seen just from going from summer into fall, some of the levels have increased just from pumping stopping and then evapotranspiration rates slowing. So just between the heavy summer and the fall, some of the well levels have gone up. But the way that we take our groundwater level measurements are we use a electric sounder or a steel tape, depending on the type of well. And we lower the sounder into the well at a normal access point, the same access point that we use every single time. So that's our reference point elevation. And then the sounder will go down and then it beeps as soon as it hits the water level. And then we just record the measurement. The measurements are on the string that goes down or the sounder that goes down into the well. And then we just note that. So, and then for the steel tape, it's kind of similar, except we chalk the bottom and then see where the water is on that chalk surface of the steel tape. And we use the steel tape just because some of the wells, the access point isn't big enough for the electric sounder to go in. So we'll use the steel tape for those wells, or if there's oil in the casing, we don't want to use the electric sounder because it might mess it up or ruin it. So I hope that's a good enough explanation.
And it looks like David has a quick question, and that's going to be the last question that we take so we can move on. So David.
Yeah, it's Sky. I'm wondering why we're not looking at the monthly readings. My understanding was there were monthly readings all summer, and wouldn't they show lower levels than this fall reading?
The summer levels, there's only 12 wells that we monitor monthly in Big Valley. And so it's not as extensive as the spring and fall runs where we measure around 47 wells in Big Valley. So the monthly monitoring is just a subset of the total wells.
But I thought we're looking at 6 wells now. Weren't all those wells monitored monthly?
No, those are not part of the monthly monitoring network. A lot of those wells, I only think 1 or 2 of the monthly wells are the RMS wells. And that, I mean, now we've done the monthly monitoring since the early 90s. So those wells were determined back in the early 90s. And so these RMS wells have just been determined.
And William, as a follow-up, Sarah just asked if people might be able to get the monthly monitoring well data to just kind of better understand in the summer. And I know that the Lake County staff is working hard to aggregate that information and have it be in a form. But
yeah, it might be a little while till we get it on our website. But if you just have, if anybody has individual inquiries, I can send that data out individually. I just don't want to post it publicly before we do our QA/QC on it and create some hydrographs for it. But if people are interested individually, just reach out and email me and I can send out the raw data that we've collected.
okay. William, if you want to give the express version of the AEM update.
Yep. So really quickly, we have confirmation. We're going to be flying over Scotts Valley again. And then on the left, you can see these are the proposed Big Valley lines. We will not be flying over the Big Valley Rancheria. And I think the AEM flight got pushed to early to mid-November now. So that's the abbreviated update.
More details as we find out more ourselves. All right. Moving on to our section that is a standing section we have, where are we at with some of the different updates to different segments of the GSP. 3 to update everybody on. First is section 5, the project and management action. That document in a draft form went to the GSPAC at the beginning of this week. And then feedback is due back from everyone by the 29th, by the end of the month. And then we're also going to have a whole section today that we're going to be talking about those PMAs, so that everybody can kind of hear a little bit about what the thinking is there. And the other is on section 3, monitoring network, and the section 4, sustainable management criteria sections. We're going to be discussing those. That's the other big chunk of today's meeting. And then updating that information. And then depending upon how our discussion goes and how quickly we can turn the documents, we're hoping to post those next week for public review so that people can take a look at them in greater detail. That's the abbreviated version, but communication and engagement plan. So there was a 15-day window that it was open for input and suggestions and just looking for general feedback from everybody. And I wanted to give just a top line. We got 2 formal submissions of feedback and information that came in via the email address that we have. And What I've done in addition to that is there's been some discussions that we've had with different advocacy groups and some different people, just asking for some general help from some key stakeholders in the basin to give us a better idea of how we can really start to tailor that particular document. The C&E plan tends to be a little on the kind of dry side and formulaic side, and we definitely want to put a little bit more customization locally to that. So the little bubbles that you see here are some of the general feedback that we got, that we heard multiple times from different people. I won't go through each one of those, but you can see what they are. We're taking those to heart, and the next time that you'll see that C&E plan is we'll be incorporating that feedback, and it will go to as a board update to the GSA board, which is the County Board of Supervisors, so that they can take a look at it too with the community input. And then that document becomes part of the public draft GSP. So there will be time to have more input, more suggestions and feedback on that as we get into mid-November, when we're calling it the public draft GSP would be going out. So that's in a nutshell where we're at with some of those section updates. Any questions? All right. So I think we're moving on to talking about modeling. Eddie?
Great, thanks, Christy. Yeah, if Ibrahim, if you could go to the next slide, just a brief update on what we're doing on the modeling side. You know, it was obvious from, I think, about a month ago, we really need to try to look at trying to incorporate frost protection into the model. And so we're looking at sort of trying to evaluate how to do that in the baseline condition. And then also it'll be helpful as we kind of move in sort of into our sort of future predictive model runs to have that ability to incorporate it. So we're working to incorporate that, and then that'll also require us to revise the model calibration. So that those two things have, you know, slowed us down a little bit, but again, it was obvious that folks want to include that, so we are doing that. And so we're kind of working through that process now. Once we get the sort of baseline, sort of the historic and the baseline recalibrated, then the next step is to look at developing some predictive model scenarios. So kind of looking at, you know, what's going to happen, what potentially could happen in the future. And so we're going to incorporate climate change. One thing that we do need feedback on, and we've gotten some from folks, is, you know, how do you all envision sort of land use? What's it going to look like in the future? So, I mean, if folks have ideas, you know, please share those now. We do have plans to have another model ad hoc meeting probably mid-November. But if we can get some of that preliminary information from you all, it would be really helpful. You know, we've got some urban growth numbers that we can kind of take from some of the county planning documents, but also, you know, agriculture. How do folks really understand how do they envision that's going to change? Some folks we've spoken to thinks it's going to decrease. Some folks think it's going to increase. So we need to kind of come up with some scenarios that we can incorporate into the predictive scenarios relatively soon. And then again, some of the model information is being utilized to develop our water budget. So again, historical water budget, baseline water budget, predictive water budget, and those are required to be included as in our case in section 3 of the GSP. So that's all kind of going on relatively really quickly. Again, I mentioned we got plans. We don't know an exact date yet. We'll bring the model ad hoc group back together to kind of showcase some of the recent changes we've made. And also talk a little bit about you know, how this information will be documented within the GSP. So again, what we envision is the model documentation itself will be an appendix within the GSP. And then also, once that information is uploaded to DWR as part of the GSP, all the applicable model files and everything will be uploaded. And I believe those will be available to the public as well. So if folks have the interest, they could kind of get in there and look at the model files. I can tell you, it's very difficult to kind of get these models up and running unless you've got somebody sort of experienced in the ModFlow OHM world. But again, being transparent, sharing that information when we can. So that's sort of a brief update on what's going on with the model. I don't know if there's any questions or if we want to kind of move on to the next slide. I see some things in the chat. I can't keep track of all of them coming in. So.
And most of them, Eddie, are just sideline comments that have nothing to do with the modeling. We're still talking about some of the flight lines for AEM and such. I'll bring it to your attention if there's something otherwise.
Okay, no worries. Okay, so moving on to the next subject, which is obviously not very favorable either, is implementation and financing. So I think, as I had mentioned at the last GSPAC meeting, the development of the GSPs, those have been sort of supported through from grants that the county applied for through DWR. Once the plans get submitted, then the plan gets submitted, then it's on sort of the local entity to sort of develop a funding structure to kind of keep the GSP process moving forward. So again, and there's some rules and regulations within the SGMA sort of legislation that allow the GSA to implement fees if need be. So I just wanted to kind of put that up there, where in that specific code it mentions that. I think, Ibrahim, if you go to the next slide. So the GSP implementation and financing. So I've included, again, this is all conceptual, sort of a table of potential costs on the right-hand side of the slides. But all of this information is going to be covered in section 6. And so within section 6 itself, and I'm not sure, I think that's probably going to be issued to you all in the next week or so, is we have to kind of go through and sort of detail out, what are the administrative costs going to be? What is the monitoring data management costs going to be? Obviously, stakeholder outreach and education is really, really important. But unfortunately, we don't know if DWR is going to continue to provide those services like they are today. So again, we need to sort of develop a funding mechanism to support that. And then also we're required by DWR to develop annual reports and 5-year updates. So again, we have to kind of lay out a plan and a schedule on how we're going to fund that. For some of the larger projects where we feel like, they're just so cost prohibitive to be funded sort of on the back of the stakeholders, those are probably going to be more funded through grant opportunities. And I'll talk about that in a second. And of course, I mentioned the schedule. We need to lay out a schedule. Again, these are required elements that we need to include in the GSP implementation section. In this case, it's going to be section 6. So going to the next slide, when we talk about financing, I'm not an expert on this, but there's sort of 2 types we've been looking at. So when I mentioned sort of projects and management actions, we're talking about the costs are quite significant. And so the capital financing that might be needed to implement those projects, I've kind of listed those in the top half of the table. So there are going to be grants available to support some of these larger projects. There could be some sort of water smart grants through the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. If need be, there could be some local bond issues required to develop projects. We kind of really want to stay away from that if we can. Private borrowing, I don't think is really feasible in this basin. And then obviously there's the SRF process, which is more geared towards the utility. So I envision any projects or management actions, I guess more projects, large scale projects are going to probably be funded through DWR grant application or grants when they become available. But again, keeping in mind, it costs resources to go after those grants. So we need to develop a funding structure that includes some resources to apply for those grants. And then funding sources really for the operations, the annual reports, the 5-year updates. There's a couple of different ways to do that. Regulatory fees, service fees, special taxes. We've seen that in some subbasins. So again, we're kind of working through that. We don't have it detailed out yet. I don't envision that happening this year, but we need to kind of continue the conversation and get that dialed in, probably after we get the GSP submitted. So that's sort of an overview on potential opportunities to generate, or actually to get access to funds. If you go to the next slide, Ibrahim. This is something that's important, and we want you all to kind of think about this. So when we start talking about fees, now these are the fees to sort of, the operational fees, the annual reports, the stakeholder outreach. How do we want to look at doing this? We could do a cost per acre. Some basins have looked at a cost per acre foot. Again, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of flow meters on our wells, so it's really difficult to quantify the exact amount of groundwater usage. So that's a little difficult to do. We could do some kind of combination. So we know that the utilities mostly they keep track of their flow, their pumping information. So we could have a combination. So it could be cost per acre, or if you do have meters, maybe you could kind of distribute the costs that way. There's been some conversations about maybe irrigated versus non-irrigated. So folks that perhaps irrigate more, should they be charged more than maybe folks that don't irrigate? There's some challenges with that because sometimes that's sort of there's a lot of resources that have to go into kind of policing that to figure out, hey, if are you really irrigating? If so, how much are you irrigating? So there's a bit of back and forth that has to happen. The county has to kind of police that. And then another concept that was brought up was, perhaps the cost could be reflective of the diameter of your well. So if you've got a well that's is 6 inches or less, perhaps that's more domestic related. If you've got a well that's 6 to 18 inches, that's more irrigation related. So could you have a fee sort of based on the diameter of your well? Again, you've got to police that. You've got to enforce it. You've got to have a way to kind of check that, field check it. So there's pluses and minuses to all this. But I think what's going to end up happening is we develop what we think the costs are going to be annually, and then we can start looking at these ratios and figure out, hey, we know the acreage, we know the non-irrigated versus irrigated, so we can start figuring out a cost per acre. And again, we're being very transparent. At some point, this will all come back to you all to get your input on. So I think with that, Christy, I am done.
And you are exactly on the button time-wise.
I
Nicely
think there were
done.
a couple of questions that are probably, it is really helpful if folks, I don't know if somebody could read the questions in the chat, I can try to address them. But
So there is a question of this fee would only apply to entities that have wells and are drawing water from the Big Valley Basin? Question mark.
maybe that's a local decision. So that there could be a cost just because you have land, even if it's not irrigated. There could be a cost. That's what's sort of agreed upon by the stakeholders and the county. That's one direction. Again, we're kind of looking at all the options, and so I don't have an answer. That's sort of a county decision.
Okay.
But it's only going to be obviously charged for folks that own property in Big Valley.
So I have 2 hands up here. Brenna will take yours first, and then David or Sky will take yours right after. Brenna?
Thanks, Eddie. I'm just trying to get an idea of the timeline of when you want input on this. I'm assuming now is fine, but are we going to have a general discussion as this sitting body, or is it more give you information and then the actual GSA can decide?
Yeah, I mean, I can let Marina kind of chime in, but I guess what I had envisioned is, once we kind of agree on what we think the costs will be, that would be shared with you all, and we would solicit input on ideas on how to chart, how to distribute that fee. But ultimately, it's on the GSA to develop the revenue that's needed to implement the GSP. But I think we're trying to be as transparent and solicit feedback from the stakeholders because it's going to be you all that have to pay for this. So that's kind of my understanding. I don't know if Marina's got.
Yeah, can I just ask? Sorry, can I ask just a follow-up clarifying question? I guess more to my question is, are we expecting the GSPAC to come up with a recommendation to the GSA, or is this going to be kind of on the GSA to decide?
I think ultimately it's on the GSA to decide.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to elaborate a little bit more on that, ideally, it would be nice to have input and guidance from the GSPAC, since that's how we're leading this entire process. And that's what the GSA is going to be looking at ultimately. But as Eddie said, it's going to be up to GSA. It's going to be up to legal. All of that has to go before legal, county legal, before we do anything. So it would be nice to have insight from stakeholders, the GSPAC, to guide those recommendations through.
David or Sky, did you have a question? Oh, you're on mute there. There you go.
Yeah, it's Sky. It's more of a comment. So I read the minutes very carefully, and I know Eddie told us about I think it was called a pay-go basis that might not be possible. And then he described 2 methods of assessing fees that were based on electoral, I guess, whatever decision, going to election. And I'm not sure that everyone on the advisory committee is acutely aware of this, but I presume that in the basin, we have many residents who, because of their immigration status, are not eligible to vote. And for people who are confused by this is not about being legal or illegal. We have people that are resident aliens, those are legal residents. And we also have people involved in the DACA program. That's the Delayed Access to Childhood Arrivals or something like that. Delayed Action for Childhood Arrivals. And many of them are now old enough to vote, but they're ineligible to vote. So, I mean, this is important just as a social justice kind of issue. But more important to this discussion is that there may be a large number of those people who are ineligible to vote due to immigration status whose jobs may be affected by this plan. So, you know, to put the funding totally through an electoral process, to me, is questionable. And, you know, so there's a real issue with this. And we see this often with agriculturally related jobs. I believe that there is a systemic racism issue, that in many people's mind, a job for a Latino person or a non-citizen is somehow less valuable. And we need to challenge that thinking in all of our own minds. Thank you.
That's a good point, Sky. I guess, you know, what we're after is ideas and solutions. So if you've got some other ideas, please share them, and we can incorporate those and have the discussions at some point. So.
Well, the pay-go thing you mentioned, we didn't really go into. I guess, doesn't that mean the Board of Supervisors says, oh, here, throw 100,000 at it, throw another 100,000 at it, something like that? I don't know what that meant. So. Yeah,
or cities or CSDs, you know, it'd be, you know, 3 or 4 entities that would be willing to pony up $100,000 each. And I just don't see those resources being available in the Big Valley Basin. But I could be wrong, and we'll start having those discussions at some point. So.
Well, and I want it noted too that as part of the meeting summary, that particular point that Sky just raised, I know that some other people were just asking for some clarification of it, that will be going forward, something that we would discuss as part of this, and make sure that we note that too. It's an important aspect. Okay. Eddie, I think we're ready to move on to number 7, and I think you're teed up for the first part of this.
Okay, great. So again, just kind of building on the SMC conversation we've had for the last 2 months. Hopefully by now, a lot of these terms and acronyms are familiar to everybody. But as we kind of put together the GSP, really there's various sections, but really what's most important is sort of agreeing on sort of their MOs and MTs, and specifically on the MTs, because that's how the plans are going to be judged, right? So we want to avoid the MTs. If we hit the MT for any applicable SMC, you know, there's what's the undesirable result. And so this is the general concept. Hopefully you all are very familiar with this. And I think with that, I'm going to kind of move through this. And again, just touching on which sustainable management criteria are important sort of in Big Valley. Obviously, it's the groundwater levels. We've talked about using groundwater levels as a proxy for storage, and we've got some clarification slides based on some conversations and feedback we got from our last meeting. Land subsidence is something we need to watch out for. I think we all agree we're not seeing it related to groundwater extraction in the basin. Another one is degraded water quality. I think probably the most difficult one in this basin is the depletion of interconnected surface waters. Ibrahim's going to talk about that later this afternoon for about half an hour. And then obviously the seawater intrusion is not really applicable. So I think with that, this was something we kind of wanted to share. And again, these are slides that came out of DWR's best management practices for how to establish MOs and MTs. So there's 3 different paths that are allowable under Sigma. So you can kind of see path A, if you kind of look at that, is, you know, the groundwater elevation is on your y-axis and you've got your time on your x-axis. But what this essentially is showing is that, you know, even in 2020, or in our case 2022, you know, you can have a decrease in water levels as long as you're avoiding your MT and you're meeting your objective by 2040 or 2042. So that's sort of a path A approach. And then a path B approach, and this is sort of more seen sort of in the San Joaquin Valley, or more common, is you can actually have your current water levels, you know, today could be below your MT, but then you're going to implement projects and or management actions to bring that water level back up and sort of make progress towards hitting your MO. And then another approach is sort of path C, which is maybe kind of similar to what I think we're seeing, is, you know, we've got water levels today that we feel are above the MT. But again, we're trying to stabilize those, and then obviously if we can bring those back up towards an agreeable MO by 2040 or 2042. So there's different paths. So as we start to kind of go through this and look at some of the SMCs, you know, there's not a one-stop shop fit model for all of these SMCs, but there's different ways. But again, the goal is to get above the MT and try to make progress towards hitting your MO. And that's what DWR is going to review us on our annual reports, is making sure we're not dipping below the MT and hitting that or becoming undesirable, or hitting an undesirable result. So
yeah, and so just to add, Eddie, this is pretty important concept, especially path A. I mean, again, in our case, we're actually not going to pursue path A or maybe C, maybe somewhere in between. What we're seeing in this basin is we want to stay fairly level. Our basin basically is not decline. Most of the wells are kind of staying fairly steady, and we want to maintain that historical trend. And so that's kind of also trying to answer some of the question from folks about you define the measurable objectives, what action you need to take to get to that measurable objectives or management actions. When you look at these different trends and how DWR define them, some cases, like here in path B, there is action need to be taken to get here. But if you're talking about somewhere like a path A or a modified path A, there might not be an aggressive action needed, just continuous monitoring. And that will be sufficient for you to get your MO.
And I have a clarification in the chat, and then I also will get to you, Pat, next with a question or comment. Bethany asked for clarification regarding the MOs. It doesn't seem like there is an actual requirement to meet the MOs in 20 years. Can you confirm this?
Yes. So from what I understand, the MO is sort of the ideal condition, but the MT is how we're going to be judged on our annual reports. So the goal, my understanding is, the goal is we need to avoid the undesirable result, which is triggered by the MT, but the goal is to get to the MO. But I don't think DWR is there's not going to be any punishment if we don't hit the MO, but there will be a punishment if we hit the MT. I don't know if others have things to want to kind of chime in on that, but that's my understanding. So,
Pat, did you have a question or comment to this?
I do. My question would be, if we're feeling like we've got a healthy basin, which all indications are that we've heard all along, is this is a very healthy basin and it recovers after a drought. Why wouldn't we set the MO right at the mean over the whatever period we're looking at? Right now it's set considerably higher. The intent of this plan isn't to improve an already healthy basin, is it? I'm just thinking, if we set the MO high, like you've got it, or you had it in the previous slides on the last meeting, an outsider looking at it doesn't know that it doesn't really mean anything. They're looking at it thinking, well, we're not attaining our objective. It seems to me that should be set more at where the median or the mean's been over the period that we're looking back.
yeah, and I think we've had some conversations about that, and I think it was just sort of the consensus was to kind of look at the historical record and try to have the MO, that met sort of a historical average. But let me kind of go through these slides, because again, we're getting to the point where we need to make these decisions. And for me, it's all about the MT. I'm not as concerned about the MO, but then, we'll take your comments into consideration, and we can maybe, if we've got time, we can chat about it now or offline. So
the only thing about setting the MO high, from an outsider, it looks like we're not achieving what we're trying to do, even if we maintain a very healthy basin. And I think that's flawed in how we're putting this together.
Sure. Like the perception. Yeah. Okay. No, we'll sort of think about how to address it. Maybe we include some text or something about the, what is the objective? That's the goal, but we're going to be judged by the MT. But we can definitely try to accommodate that concern. I don't know, Christy, do you want to kind of cover this slide before we kind of jump into
quick, just okay. super quick, Brenna asking the clarifying question about who makes the ultimate decisions kind of got at this, but just I've been asked a lot about what exactly is the GSPAC's role. And so just, those 3 quick points, just identifying and bringing to bear the resources, data and sources, and reviewing it, helping to draft the sections that everybody's been doing. And then also providing guidance, and the way that the guidance is provided is by these very discussions. So taking those roll calls and kind of seeing where you are in agreement of things, but more importantly, all the notations and all the issues that are raised as we go along are documented in those meeting summaries, and that becomes the packet that then goes to the board of directors to start making the actual decisions. And so we don't have to, just some language from the charter, and then also that scale that we've used, and we'll revisit that again when we talk about the final SMC that we need to take a roll call on. But just in a nutshell, that's what the charge is.
Okay, so kind of jumping into this, we'll start with the sort of the first SMC we talked about is the chronic lowering of groundwater levels. So the graphic on the right really gives sort of an indication of the votes we received at the last GSPAC, I think October 8th, where sort of, what percent, who would fully endorse it versus reject it. So ideally we want to keep most of the, it'd be nice if everybody sort of fully endorsed it. That generally doesn't happen. So, we're happy to see that we're sort of above neutral. So that's great. And essentially the MT, really the way it's sort of set up right now is it's the lowest historical spring groundwater elevation plus an operational flexibility margin at each RMS well for groundwater elevation. That's the threshold. The objective is the highest historical spring groundwater elevation plus an operational flexibility margin at each RMS well. And then the undesirable result was when we would see 2 out of the 6 RMS wells dip below the MT for 2 consecutive spring groundwater elevation readings. So that was sort of what we kind of proposed. And then the results sort of, again, are illustrated on the right. If we go to the next slide, some of the feedback we received based on those initial conversation we had October 8th was there was some concern about one of the RMS wells, I think it was on the southwest, where we felt like the water levels were kind of, the water levels looked like they were sort of, they fluctuated more than what we'd seen in other wells. So there were some concerns about that. And then also another concern was there was an RMS well in the northwest and the west central where we felt like we needed to move those wells closer towards maybe the center of the grid. So that was another concern that came up. And then another sort of issue was, how do we incorporate drought into this sort of threshold or into this undesirable result condition? Because again, all we can do is control sort of, the water being pumped out of the basin. We don't really have the ability to control climate. So again, we know there's going to be droughts in the future. How do we incorporate language to sort of not get ourselves in trouble when we do hit a drought? So again, we've sort of adjusted some language to kind of include that. And then also regarding the MTs, there could be some exceedances in extreme droughts, but if the water levels recover after that, then that's okay. But again, can we craft some language to include in the GSP so that's clear for the record? So those are sort of the 4 sort of general terms concerns we talked about. We heard from you all. Okay, so a couple of options here. What we're proposing is for the RMS wells, you kind of see those outlined on the slides. The only difference was in the southwest corner, we've looked at another well because again, 47 had some concerns, and we'll kind of show that here in a second. But that was the only adjustment we were talking about making. So other than moving the southwest well around, we did look at the west central and northwest, but the problem is it's the historical record. We didn't have wells that had a decent historical record. So we feel like we've selected the most representative wells for those areas. So we're not proposing any other changes for the RMS wells. And then MTs and MOs, right now, we're not considering changing any of those statements that we talked about at the last meeting. Let me get through the next slide and we can kind of open it up for some conversations. Oh yeah, we did add, I forgot about that, Ibrahim. We did add an adaptive management component. So the concern was, we don't want to react once we hit the MT. So we've included some language that hopefully you all have had a chance to read that talks about some things that could happen if we're kind of projecting or we're heading in the wrong direction. And so trying to avoid the MT, could there be some actions taken before we hit the MT? So that was another component that we added to the applicable section. So regarding the southwest well, again, this had come up at the last meeting. So the graphic on your left, that was the original well we were proposing to use. And you can kind of see those water levels are, there's a pretty good difference between, sort of spring and fall. We just felt like, is this really representative of what's going on? We had some conversations with the county, and it sounds like when the water levels are red in this well, generally the well is on, so it's pumping. So you'd expect the water levels to be a little bit lower, in some cases a lot lower. So we readjusted that. We found another well, and that's sort of depicted on the right-hand side of the screen. And you can see the water levels in that well generally seem to align with what we're seeing in other RMS wells. So we feel like that may be more representative, and the water levels being collected when the well wasn't pumping. So that's sort of the substitution we're thinking about making on that well. So now, Peter, we'll get to your question in a second here. Regarding the MT exceedances during a drought. So there could be times where the MT sort of is exceeded, but pumping hasn't changed much. So it's kind of tied back to the drought condition. So this is just this is actually clipped from the legislation, Sigma legislation. And so if you kind of read through this, I won't read the whole statement, but the paragraph that's highlighted in yellow, it says overdraft during a period of drought is not sufficient to establish a chronic lowering of groundwater levels if extraction and groundwater recharge are managed as necessary to ensure that reductions in groundwater levels or storage during a period of drought are offset by increases in groundwater levels or storage during other periods. So that kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier. There's only so much we can do. If there are droughts, then we know there's going to be droughts in the future. But if we can ensure that after the drought water levels recover, then that's okay. But we can't be responsible for drought conditions. We just have no control over it. So again, this is Sigma legislation. So we're going to take some of this language and craft it into how we determine EMT. If we go to the next slide. So that's it for water levels. Are there any questions on the water level SMC?
There's a few of them here, Eddie, just in the
Okay.
chat. Peter had asked the question about, do you mean the southwest well or is it the southeast well that was the problem? Just for clarification.
Southwest. If I said southeast, I didn't mean that.
Okay.
Yeah, the problem was 49 and we replaced it with 47.
Okay. And then Bethany made the observation, it seems like a domestic well would be more likely to be pumping in the spring than an irrigation well.
Yeah, I think maybe, but
this well was I think a livestock well used for livestock. William, correct me if I'm wrong. And for most of the time, I think it's running winter, spring, and fall.
Okay. And then Ngudu Atum had put in here, she is from Clean Water Action and has joined us on many calls. While the plan is seeking to avoid MTs, is there a plan to incorporate well protection measures for drinking water users and DACs when groundwater levels decline and MTs are met?
We incorporated that as part of the adaptive management, and we can talk about that later in the presentation today.
Yeah, I think also, I think we all agree, we don't really have a great sense of where all the domestic wells are within the basin. So that's one of the projects we're going to implement is a domestic well inventory analysis, because it's really, really difficult to sort of understand which wells are having problems when we don't really have a great data set to sort of compare it against. So we realized domestic wells, the tracking of those, trying to understand the age of those, the depths of those, that's important, and that's going to be a project within the GSP, and that kind of ties back into, I think, sort of avoiding some of their challenges.
And you'll find that when we talk about PMAs, there's a whole section on it later, and a couple of those items that you raised are in those project management actions. Sky or David, did you have a question or comment?
After the last meeting and the vote, a number of things troubled me about my vote, but one of them was this thing of using the spring level for the MT. And it's really hard for me to think about this as a single decision without it being linked to what you're calling now the PMAs. Because if I don't know what the PMAs are, I don't really know if that spring level's okay. For an actual example, so like for gardeners who are domestic well owners, I mean, if we're going to get the spring monitoring done sometime in April or May, and we get then an alert level from unfortunate levels, then do we have to throw out our spring garden preparation? I mean, it's just, I don't know, it strikes me as just it's peculiar time. And on the commercial agricultural side, I mean, what are the PMAs? You're going to tell people they can't water more than half an ET, or what are the actions? So without that to put together, I still have a hard time accepting spring monitoring as the only thing for the MT. And will the spring monitoring be before or after frost protection? Those are kind of those are my hesitancies on this whole approach.
Yeah. So as far as the spring goes, we would like to continue sort of the current period when it's monitored. What is that, March, April, William? That would be our preference. But again, that can be changed a little bit. But again, we've got to compare it to the historical record on trying to ideally capture it during a certain window.
And Eddie, just to do a quick time check, we are almost at time for the review period for the previous SMCs. So proceed accordingly.
So we're okay.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we literally have about 5 minutes to get through the next 3, but
okay,
still want to foster the discussion. But
sure. All right. Well, the next couple I think are pretty straightforward. So again, the second one is reduction in groundwater storage. Sort of very similar graphic. It seems like sort of the votes we received are all above neutral, which is okay. And really what we're using as a proxy for storage is water level. So the graphic sort of on the left-hand side of your screen there shows sort of the idea of how do we use groundwater levels as a proxy. So there's sort of 2 graphics there. There's one on your left, sort of the furthest left, that sort of shows you the aquifer in a sort of a cartoon depiction, and it shows you sort of where storage is with the line, the blue box. And so the red dash line actually would represent water levels. So again, if we can keep that red dash line stable, then it shows you that the storage is stable. So that's kind of the idea of why we're using a proxy. We're using water levels as a proxy for storage. So hopefully that kind of clarifies things. So ideally, if we keep water levels constant in the bathtub, the amount of water in the bathtub stays the same. So that's the idea. So I think land subsidence was a pretty easy one to get through. We're utilizing INSAR data that we've been told is going to be flown annually now by DWR. We're going to select a couple of pixels next to the representative RMS wells so we can kind of tie water level fluctuations to sort of fluctuations in subsidence, which we won't see. Again, there's the graphic on the left, on the right, that kind of shows where folks were sort of in the ranking. Seems like more fully endorsed votes, which is good. And then we lay out the MTs and MOs. I think there was one difference on the undesirable results. Some of the feedback we got was right now, I think we had a 2 out of 6. Actually, can you go to the next slide there, Ibrahim? Yeah, so one of the concerns was we had 2 out of 6 for subsidence. And so we're saying, okay, maybe we need to adjust that.
We had 3 out of 6.
Sorry, 3 out of 6, adjusting that to 2 out of 6 represents the same sort of percentages as the water levels and change in storage. So which is fine. We're okay with that. So no big deal on that one. The next one is degraded water quality. And again, folks, just some clarification. We need to show sort of a causal link between groundwater pumping and impacts to sort of change in groundwater quality. So the easiest sort of way to envision this is, imagine if you had a gas station, you had a plume that leaked out of the gas station. If we had pumping in the area that was sort of dragging that plume, that contaminated plume, and expanding it within the aquifer, we can control that, right? Because we shouldn't be pumping so much water. Some of the other applications related to sort of pesticide applications, we have no control over that. That's sort of developed through other programs. So again, what we're trying to do is sort of show that causal link between groundwater pumping and having an impact on water quality. And the cartoon on the right, this is all Ibrahim's credit, sort of shows you an example as if you had brackish water in an aquifer system and you were pumping water deep from, say, deep wells, and you were causing that brackish water to kind of come up into the fresh aquifer system. That would be a a process that the GSA could control. We could just say, no, you can't pump these deep wells and cause that sort of upconing. That's just a sort of a, an illustration of what we're talking about when it comes to water quality. Regarding the MTs and MOs, again, you can kind of see the graphic on the right. Most folks, again, are above sort of the neutral vote on that. What we're proposing for MT is a TDS of 750 and an MO of 500. And so, again, similar undesirable results. We went 2 out of the 7 wells. We added an additional well for this particular SMC. Once those hit the threshold for 2 consecutive years, then it have to be a project and or management action to address that. Some of the feedback we received on that was, concerns about the accuracy of the water quality samples. So, we have done some baseline sampling. DWR did it for us. We're pretty confident that's is good data. There was some concerns about maybe the sampling approach where the well's purged long enough, those kind of things. As part of our sort of monitoring network going forward, we will develop an SOP so folks can get a sense of what that's going to involve and what's the process going to be. There were some other considerations about setting the MT at 1,000 instead of consider setting the MT at 1,000 to account for lack of historical data. Again, from what we've seen, is the water quality with respect to TDS is good in the Big Valley. So I'm not as concerned. We're not as concerned about that. And then another consideration was setting the MT at or above the secondary MCL of 500. So again, there's another slide I think that kind of addresses some of those concerns. Ibrahim, if you go to that. So these are sort of some language that we've selected from the regional board when it comes to sort of secondary drinking water standards. So again, these are not enforceable, and it's mostly related to aesthetics, so color, taste, odor. But there's no risk of health risk to humans if you exceed the secondary MCL. And then the graphic on the right-hand side of your screen, what that's showing you is if you kind of look at TDS, the recommended secondary the secondary MCL for TDS is 500, and in some cases it can go up to 1,000, and then short-term exposure can be at 1,500. So we feel like sort of what we're proposing is adequate, and it meets sort of any secondary standards. So we feel like our selection is okay on that. So do you want to go to the next slide, Ibrahim? Okay, if you want to stop there and maybe back up a little bit. I don't know, Christy, if we have questions, or do we want to spend
Sure.
a few minutes?
Sarah has a question.
I was one of the people that had a problem with the MT, but seeing that so my problem with the MT before is that it appeared that you were setting it below the MCL. And I had a problem with that because I don't think we, even though it's a secondary contaminant, it's still part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. But it looks like setting the MT at 750 means that we don't want it to even go. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's still. I still have a problem with it then, because the recommended level is 500 milligrams per liter for TDS, and if you're setting the MT at higher than that, that's basically saying we're going to accept that the TDS can go higher than the Safe Drinking Water Act is recommending. And I just don't think that's good precedent to set for anything that has to do with standards and protocol for anything managed by the county. So I still have a problem with that. And even though EPA doesn't enforce them, those are recommended maximum contaminant levels for a reason. And they do change over time given additional data and health studies.
Sure.
So yeah, I just think it's very poor protocol.
Okay. I guess my only comment would be on the MO, I guess on the secondary MCL. I mean, in some cases it can be above 1,000. So that 500 to 1,000 is kind of, what I would say is the sort of sweet spot. So that's why we said, well, let's set the MO at 500. And I think there was some discussion about having the MT at 1,000, but we said, no, let's be a little more conservative and bring it to 750. But
it's just, I mean, I've managed 2 public water systems before in my job at Big Valley, and the MCLs are like the Bible. I mean, there's a reason for maximum contaminant levels of various contaminants in drinking water, And these are wells that, you know, some of these are domestic wells. And I don't think it's right for our group to be identifying standards or minimum thresholds or thresholds that will be actually out of compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. I don't even understand why you would do that.
Sure. But again, they're secondary MCLs, so they're not enforceable. So
They're not enforceable, but there's still maximum contaminant levels for the Safe Drinking Water Act. Like, why would we do that? Why wouldn't we want to be, you know, why would we want to exceed a recommended maximum contaminant level in drinking water?
Right.
Like, what is that? Who's that benefiting exactly?
okay, no, I mean the comments noted. So
Bethany had a further clarifying question. Is the plan still to monitor for the full list of constituents discussed in earlier meetings? And how is that information going to be shared?
yeah, so we're working through it. My sort of thought was we would probably monitor for TDS, you know, annually, and then maybe every 3 years, every 5 years, we do a larger sort of suite of analytical that maybe we compare to what was done by DWR earlier this year. That might be one approach. Again, it sort of really kind of goes back to, you know, how we develop the cost, like who's going to pay for that. So that's the challenge. TDS is relatively inexpensive to run, but I think at least every 5 years we'd probably do a larger suite of analytical analysis. So. Any more questions, Christine?
No, I don't see anything.
Okay.
So we move on to 7.15. 7.15.
Right.
Talking about surface water depletion.
Christy, when are we taking the break?
I have it that we are taking the break at about 12:40. If people feel like they would rather take it right now, we can certainly do that.
I'm okay with moving forward still.
Okay.
All right.
With everyone.
So depletion of interconnected surface water. So a few definitions, and then we'll kind of get into the meat of this one. So depletions, by depletion, we mean reduction in surface water flows due to groundwater pumping. So what means is we need to quantify what the natural recharge would have happened anyway without groundwater pumping in the basin. And then when you overlay ground pumping on top of that, the increase of losses from surface water streams to groundwater, that is what is called depletions. And the key mechanism for how that happens is because groundwater elevation basically lowers groundwater elevation in the basin compared to no pumping scenario. And that reduction basically, as you can imagine, you have a lower bathtub, therefore kind of induce a little bit more recharge into the basin from surface water. So DWR requires that the minimum threshold metric need to be a rate or a volume of surface water as simulated by an integrated hydrological model. This is key because depletion of this rate of depletions, CFS or volume of water going out the stream into the groundwater, is a quantity that you cannot measure directly. So there's no way you can come in and just kind of put and measure on the stream how much water is leaving the stream. You have to infer those measurements. There is multiple ways you do it. DWR recommend you using a groundwater model to simulate after you calibrate the model. But DWR also in the regulation and in its guidance says other approaches are also acceptable if you don't have a groundwater model. May also be valid. So for our case here in Big Valley, we looked at the two primary creeks, Kelsey Creek and Adobe Creeks, and we developed two modeling scenarios. One representing existing condition or current condition, so that's basically 2018 land use and the reported level of urban pumping. And then we added a no pumping scenario where we turned off all pumping. No water for ag, no water for domestic use, no water for urban. So just absolutely no pumping anywhere in the basin. And then we compare these two scenarios. The difference between how much water left the creek under these two different scenarios is a rate of surface water depletions due to groundwater extraction in the basin. So in the next few slides, I'll be going through the result of these simulations for both Kelsey Creek and then Adobe Creek. So for Kelsey Creek, this chart shows the simulated annual depletion. So this on average, annually, what is the rate of depletions? And the y-axis is in cubic feet per second. Long-term average is about 1.9, almost 2 cubic feet per second of depletions, i.e. increased losses from the creeks due to groundwater pumping. And that is about, in reference, about 1,400,000 acre feet or 1,400 acre feet per year. So 1.4 thousand acre feet or 1,400. That represents about 3% of the total Kelsey Creek flow. And then those depletion again varies from high of 2.4 to a low of about 1.5 cubic feet per second. One thing we kind of notice in the model that most of the depletion happens downstream of the main street bridge and almost 30% to 9% upstream of the bridge. Again, we share, I mean, you've seen this chart before where we kind of explained looking at groundwater elevations in the spring, so representing a wet condition in the spring. The groundwater elevation is fairly high, and there is a strong hydraulic connectivity almost up to or a little bit beyond the main street bridge. In a fall year like 2015, which is kind of was a drought year, and you see that basically there is a big disconnect between the creek downstream of the main street bridge. That explains kind of the model results of having 70% of the depletion downstream here and only 30% upstream from that section. To validate the modeling result we've done, we looked at the observed flows. So the observed model flows. So these are actual stream flow measurement at Kelsey Creek. The blue lines are USGS gauge. The orange is DWR gauge. And so we kind of calculated the average for each month, and we kind of plot them each other. And so what you observe is, as you expect, there is a little bit more flows upstream than downstream, more upstream than downstream. So when there is more up than downstream, you can see the percentage loss. That indicates there is a loss between upstream and downstream. But there kind of an observation. If you look between January through March, you would see there are actually more flows downstream than upstream. This can be explained by this is the rainy season, and there could be some contributing streams going below the gauge or overland runoff from rain. And so you can see here there's a little bit more water downstream than upstream. However, if you look at the long-term average, the stream flow data says the depletion is about 2.2 cubic feet per second on average. Let me go back a couple of slides, and our model predicted 1.9 cubic feet per second. So 2 versus 2.2, fairly close. And if we look at just ignore this month or these 3 months, I mean January, February, March, when the stream is gaining, just look at when the stream is losing. Between April and December, the rate of the loss is between 3 to 10 CFS. So that's kind of what you look at the loss here. Again, one thing to note that these reduction in stream flow are encompass other elements in the model. The model only try to predict depletions. The reduction in groundwater stream flow can also be related to some diversions in the stream. If there is any habitat uptake, I mean, we all noticed the riparian habitat along the creek, so they take water from the creek, and also evaporation and evapotranspiration from the creek. Just looking at these two sets of data, we feel pretty good that the model result kind of is kind of fairly representative of what's happening on the ground. On Adobe Creek,
Ibrahim, before you go on to the Adobe Creek, I just have two quick things. Bethany made the observation that the model is not yet calibrated, so these are preliminary results. And David Weiss had the question, how many gallons per minute per CFS?
Eddie, can you help with that? Or John?
Oh, he just did. Eddie just put it in the chat, so thank you, Eddie.
Yeah, I guess regarding the calibration, no, you're right, Bethany. We're adjusting the model just based on the feedback on the frost protection scenario. I don't think it's going to change very much, but we'll obviously rerun this once we have the sort of calibrated, updated model. So,
yeah. Well, on Adobe Creek, a similar pattern. The average annual is about 2.5 CFS, so we see a little bit higher depletion on Adobe Creek compared to Kelsey Creek. The 2.5 CFS is represent about 9% of the total Adobe Creek flows. One explanation to see here is this large disconnect we see along the entire Adobe Creek between wet condition and dry condition, again between spring, a wet spring and a dry fall. You see the entire creek is kind of disconnected, and then which kind of may induce kind of higher depletion during the creek. This is based on stream flow for Adobe Creek. This is data. We don't have a lot of good gauging data on Adobe Creek. All of it is pretty old, so we have kind of I was lucky to get some of the synthetic stream flow data that was kind of developed by Flow West by looking at the historical data in the 1970s and then kind of correlating it with the Kelsey Creek flow data to generate synthetic data for Adobe Creek. And then basically it kind of tells, so unfortunately I said we only have flows going into Adobe Creek, so we don't have a way to verify the depletion downstream. But you can see is basically Adobe Creek barely have flows in June, between June and October. Most of the flows are between November and May, again consistent with rain fed watershed. So why do we care about these depletions? Again, 3% or 2% or these depletions. Why we care about these depletions? Sigma cares about this depletion from the perspective of the beneficial users, and ask us the question: are these depletions significant and unavoidable, and do they result in undesirable results? So that's kind of the next set of slides I'm going through here, looking at this depletion from the perspective of two important beneficial users of the creek. We have the hitch, who uses the creek mostly in the spring for migration and spawning, and then also the habitats along the GDEs or potential GDEs that we identified along the creeks, who, although they could rely on groundwater, but they also rely part of the year on surface water, could be relying part of the year on surface water. So we want to make sure these depletion are not affecting these beneficial uses. I think you all have been seeing these slides from USGS. I think was presented at a meeting this week or last week. Again, presenting a pretty dire picture for the hitch and its survival. And so that's kind of make it important for us kind of to consider how these depletions or stream flows affecting the hitch or not. And so we took the depletions and plotted the in green here, the simulated depletions, and we plotted them against the observed stream flows. This is a typo. This should be for Kelsey Creek. And what we've seen is basically the depletion typically during during the spring time frame. But when you look at these depletions, I mean, it's kind of pretty clear that this amount of depletion is pretty small compared to the magnitude of the stream flow. And in general, and so they don't substantially affect the stream flows. So that's one. However, we also have to kind of put that out there is also been discussion through this GSPAC meeting on the question of frost protection. And we have to come out and say we do not have the data to be able to detect the effect of frost protection on stream flow during the spring season. To do that, you need to have a much more, again, frost protection happens for 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day for a couple nights in a row or so. And so that effect and the model we're using, the result we're presenting is like a 2 weeks time steps. So even if you include the modeling, the frost protection, you won't see any impact. And the frost protection will have impact only if it is pretty close to the stream and shallow wells connect to the streams. Anyway, so I don't want to go into that speculation. All what we say is the depletions to your groundwater pumping in the basin affecting the stream flows does not appear to have significant impact on stream flows, especially during the spring time frame. The question about the frost protection is something has to be addressed separately. On Adobe Creek, again, very similar pattern and very similar issue too, slightly higher depletions, but on the larger scheme of things, when you look where the depletion is happening, most of the depletions, you have mostly high flows, and the impact is likely to be small. I noted here, based on documents from California, from CDFW, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, on representing some certain events of fish rescue, especially hitch rescue. There is document about fish rescue between 2014 and 2019. 2014, there were 2 events related to hitch rescue on Adobe Creek. The rest of the events happened on Coles Creek and other creeks. I didn't find evidence on Kelsey Creek, but those fish rescue, as you can see, they're happening pretty late in the season, and would kind of explain why you would see something like that during this part of the season. Again, the flows in the creek is pretty low, and the chances of entrapment is high. Again, similar to what we talked about Kelsey Creek, we feel the depletions based on the groundwater use in the basin are not affecting stream flow substantially. The question of frost protection and its localized impact on a specific location or section or couple wells or few wells is outside of the evaluation, the data we have to be able to evaluate or consider, and that's something that has to be addressed separately. Moving on to the next beneficial users is the GDEs. As you can see, we identified a couple, maybe 2 or 3 large groups of GDEs along Kelsey Creek, above Adobe Creek, and along McGow Creek, and then all of these riparian habitat kind of along the water bodies. These insets here, this is for Kelsey Creek, and this is for Adobe Creek. I shows this shows the remote sensing data to show the health of these habitat and the change in habitat between 1985 and 2018. And you can, as you can see, most of it is green. That means there is a moderate increase. Yellow, no change, and these spots of orange is a moderate decrease between 1985 to 2018. And overall, the picture, we feel that there has been little change on an average, little change on the extent and the conditions of the GD of these habitat along the creeks. We took a step further. We kind of pulled out the data from data provided by TNC and DWR. The green line shows the Ndvi on top chart. Ndvi is the greenness index, again developed from the remote sensing. I mean, more recent through 2018, we see the data indicate groundwater GDE's health is fairly above average. I mean, it's even during the drought of 2015, it means dipped a little bit, but kind of recovered fairly quickly. This is for and then also for the MDMI, which is the wetness, kind of talking about whether there is a dry events. You can see, yep, it can detect the drought signal in 2015, but then the habitat recovered. We overlaid that with the model depletions. We don't see strong correlation again, and even the correlation itself is not very important. The important is during all this time period, with depletion going up and down, different levels, the GDEs remained fairly healthy over this period. We observed the same pattern on the areas above Adobe Creek, even to the degree that there is way less any relationship. Again, this habitat is above Adobe Creek Reservoir and potentially not affected by this depletion, but it's another check we've done.
Ibrahim, can I jump in here? Bethany has been most patient with her hand up and has had a couple questions. Bethany, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. Yeah, my first question was, let's see.
You had are the depletions averaged over the entire stream? Are there differences by location on streams?
Yeah, and you might have covered that, but yeah, just confirm.
The way the model does it is basically based on the, we break the streams into cells, and so each cell is calculated based on the groundwater elevation in that area. And so you find some cells losing, gaining by different section, and changing over time. So the result here is all averaged. These results are averaged over the entire creek and across all of the simulation period. Then in the modeling appendix and the results, you will be able to see. I mean, I think I'm not sure if we're printing all that data, but it should be there, all of it in the model.
Yeah, well, this is Eddie here. What we'll try to do, Bethany, on that is we'll have some kind of color scheme, so you'll be able to see across each cell, is it gaining or losing. That'll be in the model documentation.
Okay. So it's just really based on the elevations. It's not based on the subsurface at all.
It based on two things. It's based on I mean, the driver is hydraulic. So how far groundwater elevation is from the bed of the creek. That's one. And then the two, dictate the amount, how much water is leaving the creek depends on the soil geology, the surface geology, based on the geological maps. And that indicate the rate. So if the two locations have the same head difference, it will be different. Yeah.
Okay, so there's not a whole lot of resolution in the, like, whether it's gravel downstream or clay upstream, like that doesn't seem to be coming into play here.
If it is part of the surface geology, it should be coming in there.
Yeah. It's based on superficial geology maps. So we see areas that are more porous, but I mean, you're right. It's what else do we have? So.
Yeah, and I think that kind of would explain the difference between Adobe Creek and Kelsey Creek in rates.
Yeah, I don't think those geology maps from everyone that I've seen doesn't really offer that sort of resolution. It's more below the creek bed. I mean, it might call it alluvium or something, but
we also have well completion reports. We also have well completion reports if there's wells that are kind of close to the creek, you know, because they typically start logging those, you know, 10 feet below, well, 5 feet below ground surface. So yeah, I think we all realize it's not perfect, but you know, that's all we have.
Okay, so you're bringing that data in. The well completion reports is also part of that. It's not just the geology maps from like USGS or something.
Yeah, anything we can get that's sort of site specific, we try to incorporate. So.
Yeah, so
Okay, and then my other question was the Ndvi, the basically judging the health based on how green it is. Are you doing that for the potential areas along the riparian zones, all along those creeks, all those blue areas as well?
Unfortunately not. Only in these two insets. This one on Kelsey Creek and one Adobe Creek.
Are you planning on doing it for the riparian areas as well?
No, because we don't have the data. Unfortunately, this is the only data set that has been processed by TNC. When TNC looked at this watershed, they only identified these two insets, these two areas as GDEs based on the high-level criteria they use for the entire Central Valley. And then they processed all of these remote sensing data for these two locations. For everything else, this is something you were part of the discussion where we kind of went in and identified these based on input from the GSPAC members, that these actually could be GDEs too.
Well, I mean, if the Nature Conservancy did a process, they probably just used available satellite imagery data, and that could also be processed in the same way to expand the distinction based on, you know, what we think should be included. So I don't know how that's incorporated, because y'all are running tight on your schedule, but I would think that we'd want to try to do that.
It will be, I think TNC would be open if we reached out to them via DWR and said, hey guys, we kind of have identified these. Can you run these for us? So I think they have the resources and they can do it, and it will be good. So we can get these independently verified data sets also.
That would be great. And how does that get handled, like through this process?
Eddie, I think that's something we can, we can add it into the something nice to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you know, I think this analysis is going to become more and more frequent as part of TNC's work. And this sort of approach is kind of one of their best management practices they recommended on this sort of surface, or the GDE analysis anyway. Yeah. So, you know, unfortunately, this is what we have to work with today. Now, getting access to those additional data sets and processing that, I mean, that's going to have to happen, you know, GSP implementation, I think.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with including that as one of the management actions to kind of coordinate with TNC, see if they to expand their data sets here in Big Valley.
Yeah.
I think this is what will probably benefit others too.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Ibrahim, just as a quick time check, we're drawing to the close of the presentation portion of this and the need to go ahead and take roll call on it and to move on soon.
Yeah,
So,
I'll be quick.
sure.
So,
And then just really quickly, both Peter and Sarah had made comments. Peter and Sarah, did you want to say anything in addition to those comments that you made in the chat about the flows and the GDEs and the evaluation of full creeks?
I'm fine.
Okay. Peter? Okay, we'll let the chat stand as record. Thank you.
okay. So to establish the SMCs and for the depletion of interconnected water, we can use, DWR says you could use the model results, depletions, or you could use another proxy. So in this plan, we propose to use proxy by looking at wells that are fairly close to the creeks. I mean, again, they're not perfect. They're fairly close to the creek, and looking at the groundwater elevation within these wells. And then basically we're making the case that as long as groundwater elevation within these wells remain within the historical band that we observed in the past, so there is no big changes, we should be okay from a depletion perspective. So that's kind of the simple proxy we're going with. The problem with this approach, and to be the first one to acknowledge it, is the wells we have selected are the best we have, but ideally you need to have a very shallow well, 20 feet, 30 feet deep well, to be able, and pretty close to the creek, to be able to measure that. We may be able to get those wells done in the future, but we're working with the best we have, and so this is the well we selected. I think as part of the review on the SMC section, we got also feedback, and to address this pretty on from Bethany. You suggested we look at other wells close this one, and you recommended 2 that have monthly data instead of this one that have biannual data. We checked with William, and both wells, unfortunately, we have problem with them. One of them is discontinued since 2013 and is no longer monitored, and I think that other one is the same thing. So unfortunately, we could not use nearby wells here that they have used to have monthly data sets not being monitored for the future.
Bethany, did you have a quick question?
Yeah, one of the wells that I proposed has data that's recent after 2015. It has,
yep.
I have to look at my records, but the fact that they're discontinued doesn't seem to reflect what I've received as a record for those wells.
Yeah, William, do you want to answer those 2 wells? I think Jeevan reached out to you. Or
yeah. Yeah, we do have recent for one of them, but it's just been oil in the casing. So every time that we do it, it's really hard to get accurate results and very tedious with the steel tape, and we don't really know if we're getting a representative or accurate water level. And so that was the deal with one of them. And then the other one, like Ibrahim says, the owner stopped giving us access quite a while ago. So I think one of them does have relatively recent data for, but the records and the last reading are indicating oil in the casing and making it really, really difficult to read that well.
Okay, Peter has his hand up, and I'm going to take that as the last question, and then Ibrahim, if we could wrap this up and go to a roll call. Peter, did you want to have a question, comment? You're on mute, Peter.
A clarification request is Are you saying that in order for wells to have an impact, to be a measurable impact on the stream flow, they must be close to the stream and shallow? And if that's the case, if they're far away and deep, then it's not expected they would have a measurable effect on the stream flows.
It's very difficult to have a generic answer to that because geology varies from place to place. But in general, yes. The shallower the well, the closer the well to the creek, the more impact it could have.
And to follow, I assume that also means the volume of water being pumped. As, for example, to distinguish between an irrigation domestic well that pumps a little bit of water periodically versus an irrigation well that's a large well with large volume.
Correct. Yeah. I mean,
this is John. Can I clarify that we're talking about RMS wells? So we're looking at
we're talking general about impact of pumping on stream flow.
Oh, okay. So I thought we were talking about RMS. Sorry.
Yeah. So, so then just quickly, I know I'm out of time here. For the interconnected surface water, our SMCs follows the same logic that we have for the lowering of groundwater. We look at the minimum threshold. We look at the lowest spring that observed. We add a margin of operational flexibility, and then we set that as the MT. Again, the logic is we want to keep the groundwater elevation within the historical observed range. The margin for operational flexibility account for uncertainty in measurement, maybe unforeseen drought events and so forth, but overall, it's kind of fairly the same level. But then we also, in this case, we added another check, make sure our MT does not exceed the 30 feet depth, which is the max routing depth recommended by TNC for habitat in general. For the measurable objectives, again, we look at the highest spring, and then we add a measure of operational flexibility down, representing about 20% of the range. So that's bring groundwater elevation down. So it's now within, to give us a little bit more operational flexibility. When we plot 2015 and 2021 data on these wells, you can see it's fairly falls comfortably within the levels here, between above the MT and for all of these wells. We don't have data for this well. Hopefully we can start collecting data on this well going forward, but we didn't have data on this well since 2015. So the minimum threshold we're proposing then is lowest historical spring plus an operational margin, but capped at the maximum GDE's routing depth. For the measurable objectives is the highest spring elevation plus an operational flexibility margin at each RMS. And then we detect the depletions when 2 out of 6 wells fall below their MTs for 2 consecutive years at the same sites. And we're not setting milestones for our measurable objectives. Again, the reason is we're fairly at the same range at the measurable objectives. So we're not setting milestones to get to the measurable objectives.
Ibrahim, I have 2 hands up, and also Sarah asked the question if they had been adjusted to remove any outliers.
That's correct.
Okay.
So
and then
they have been modified to remove outliers.
Okay, and then I have 2 hands up. Sarah's was first, and then Pat. So we'll get to you both. Sarah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point. I think Peter had asked a question about the well's proximity to the creeks, and the impacts. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife requires a fish and game permit 1600 for impacts to stream bed and stream bank alterations if a well is shown to be impacting surface water flow. And those are normally what you would be finding within the riparian zone of a creek. And I did check the 1600 permits for Adobe and Kelsey Creeks a few years ago, and found that there were no permits that were taken out on any wells that were alongside the creeks or near the creeks, and found out that really within the county of Lake, there's no system to kind of follow up on that. Like the environmental health department is who issues the well permits, and there's really kind of no checking in with CDFW about impacts, and you basically have to report a well for being impacted. There's no proactive movement from environmental health, the well driller, the owner of the well, or Fish and Wildlife to check on that. It's like it has to be complaint. It seems like it has to be complaint driven. So I just want to point out that it's entirely possible that we have wells that are within the vicinity of any of the creeks and are impacting the flow with their pumping, even for a short period of time. But they are supposed to be going through and getting a 1600 permit, which would require an evaluation of, which would basically be conducting an evaluation of the environmental evaluation of their well pumping.
Pat, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, again, I had a question. I'd actually like an explanation for it if possible, of why we're not setting the MO here at the historical average versus the way we've come about it.
The MO, the measurable objective.
Yeah, it's I mean, if we've got a healthy basin, why are we setting that higher than what we've averaged over this period of time? It just seems like we're setting ourselves up for failure.
This is so look at this is an example. We have the orange circles here, or the red circles, represent the spring level or the highest spring level. And so we look at the lowest spring, in this case happened in 76, and then we add a margin, so that's become our MT. So that's what we ask DWR to judge us on. And then we look at this max spring, and then we added this operational margin, and we say, ideally, we want the basin to be around this point. And is that something extreme or not achievable? I mean, you look at it, we were here in the 80s, in the 90s, in 2004, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11, and even 12. And then we're almost there in 2018, a wet year. So this MO is basically indicates kind of we are at or above the MO anytime we have a wet winter. And so, in other words, you're asking, can we take this range here and calculate the average and put the MO here? I mean, it's possible. You could do that.
What's the explanation for not doing that, I guess, is my question.
I can jump in here, Ibrahim, real quick. So because I remember having this conversation, a couple meetings ago, and I think we kind of provided a couple of options. I mean, I think even I said, let's pick an MO at 2015. But we, we can evaluate that if folks want that done. And so essentially the idea would be, instead of picking the highest spring elevation ever, we take an average of the spring. I don't think it's going to change things much, but in some cases it'll show us that we're actually operating above the MO or within a margin of error of that. So I don't have a strong preference on the MO, because I think regardless of which one we pick, we're in pretty good shape. But I think there's also the public perception that's important. So, you know,
And that's my biggest concern, the
Sure.
public perception. If we set the MO higher than is going to be achieved in most years,
right.
the public perception is that the plan's not doing what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
I have 2 other hands up, and I want to do a time check that we're running about 10 minutes behind, and we definitely want to make sure that we get to the PMAs today to discuss those preliminarily. So with that, I'll go to Peter, had his hand up next, and then David or Sky, you'll be after Peter. Well, Peter, you're on mute.
I'll lower my hand up because my question was directed to the same sort of thing that Pat is directed to. So, and I would agree with him entirely. I think we are setting ourselves up for real problems.
David or Sky?
Yeah, this is David, and I have the same point. I just, you know, if our management objective is the equivalent of what the valedictorian got, you know, on their grade point average, then, you know, everybody is going to fail most of the time. And I don't think that that's the goal of this whole thing. I mean, we've got a healthy basin, and, you know, if we are shooting for an average of the up and down year to year, I think that's plenty. And that should be our objective. It's not going to change what we're doing, but it's going to make us look bad because we're going to fail more often than is really relevant. Thank you. Or Sky.
Yeah, this is Sky. So I'm looking at this one about the Adobe Creek on Bell Hill Road slide, and I don't get it on all those places where the readings are so low, like 77. I mean, I can't see all their years, but there's a whole bunch of them way below the MT. I mean, what happened to the hitch that year? Did they all die? Or, I mean, why isn't the MT being calibrated to hitch survival or hitch vigor?
This is fall measurement, and during fall measurement the creek is dry, so there is no water in the creek anyway. There is no hitch. Hitch is tied to the spring.
Okay, so the MT is for the spring or the fall?
MT for the spring.
Okay, so the MT is below the minimum, but still, in these years of the water level is so much lower. What are those blue lines? Aren't those the? I guess I'm confused. I don't get it.
So just focus on the red circles. These are the spring measurement.
Okay.
And everything on the blue line is measurement other time of the year, mostly the fall. So just focus on these red dots here.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So Christy, how do you want to do this? There is, I mean, looking back to the MO, there is SMC, sorry. I think we can take a roll call on the minimum thresholds. Then we could do a minimum and the desirable result which go with it. On the measurable objectives, we have, I think, probably we can ask for a motion, because now we have folks asking for changing this from the highest historical plus a margin for operational flexibility to change this to average spring. And if folks, I don't know, I let you run this part, Christy.
Sure. So I think what we should do is if the motion, or if there have been several people who have said about that measurable objective, about changing it for the average of spring, of putting that out there and then taking the roll call based on that change in it and seeing where we are with numbers. Does that sound good to everybody?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put just a call for numbers, noting that that is with that change in the measurable objective, positing it with the average spring. If you go to the next slide, I believe, or 2 slides down, Ibrahim, then you'll get to the gradient scale so people can take a look at that while they're coming up with their numbers. If you wouldn't mind. Actually, you can just go forward. I think I put another one in there. If you go forward. Oh, there you go. So again, that's our scale of agreement with 1 through 6. And if you'd like, you feel free to leave any message with your number as to how you're feeling. I think the motion was, David asked for clarification. I think that we are looking to take a poll of where people sit with their agreement number based on that being the spring average. That was
BMO,
posited by a
right.
few people. Yeah,
Okay.
correct. And it looks like we're waiting for just 2 more folks to chime in here. Pat, did you have a question?
I did. I would ask you, Christy, if you could do the same thing for the basis of the EMO on the groundwater levels, on the lower end groundwater levels.
So going back and taking a roll call on that particular one?
Correct.
Okay. We're waiting for just one more entry on this one. Sarah, I'm not seeing anything recorded for you. If you'd like to park that and wait and come back to it or give it further consideration, we can go back to the, thank you very much. All right, so it was SMC 1 that you wanted to revisit, is that correct?
So Christy, what's the result of 5?
Let's see here. I have 2 5s and all the rest are 2s.
So that's 2 5s and 8 2s.
Correct.
Okay.
That is correct. And what I also would like to do is I would like to record in the chat, knowing that our time that we have to move forward is that I would like the 5s if they could, and it can be done in a variety of ways. You can privately message me, you can put it in the chat if you like, or however. What might it take to move toward a 1, 2, or 3 for that? Because we do like to record that of what some of the opportunity is for us to move.
Okay.
Those. And so we're going back to 1. There's been a call to take roll again on number 1.
And Christy, I think the only part of the role on number 1 is whether is changing the MO. I'm not, if there were other issues there, those probably.
So how we might want to handle that is we might want to say, is there any objection? If there's even one, then we would go back to doing a roll call of number of it. But are there any objections to changing that measurable objective for number 1? Okay. Does anybody want to review what their number was in light of that measurable objective consideration? We can let it stand.
Okay, really confusing.
Yeah.
David's got his hand up, Christine.
Yep, David, Sky.
Sky wanted to comment on his number
Sure.
5.
Yeah, I voted 5, I guess. Well, first off, because this seems to me really it's a frost protection versus fish issue. I mean, that may be incomplete to summarize it like that. And I think the frost protection thing is so important that I want to be absolutely certain. And I don't have, what do you call them, the PMAs that would happen if we exceeded that minimum threshold. And I can't, without knowing that, I can't see this as a complete package. And then aside from that, the data is a little bit confusing, and I don't really get why we wouldn't monitor the water in the creek during a frost protection event, and rather than all this looking at the wells at the springtime sampling. I mean, I just, the whole thing just seems confusing to me, and I think the ramifications of it are so important that I'm not ready to say right on to it. So that's my reasoning.
Okay.
I think just to follow up on that, I mean, I think Sky, our plan in the PMAs is to develop a more accurate, more representative monitoring network, you know, with wells and stream gauges. So I think we're trying to work towards, you know, collecting more more representative and refined data. So we've got that proposed as a PMA. So.
Okay. Christy, do we need to, what's the decision on the lowering groundwater SMC?
So I think that it was just that nobody called for a recall of it in light of changing that MO. So I think we stand on what we had before. And then it looks like we've got number 5. We've got all of ours recorded, and any kind of key issues have been noted.
So Christy, are we changing the MO or not changing the MO?
I believe that we are changing the MO on it, correct?
Okay, thank you.
Yes, correct. So what I would like to do, I know that we have about a 30-minute presentation on the PMAs that we have to do, and Tori's done a good job of preparing for that, but I do want to give everybody a bio break very quickly. So if everyone can take a very quick break, and we'll be back here at 1:10, ready to go with the PMAs. Everybody break for just a couple minutes.
Did we do a vote on what Pat had asked for?
We didn't, nobody wanted to make nobody needed to change their vote based on that MO change, Peter. So we just left it as is. We left it as is, noting that we've made that change in the MO.
Well, but Pat was asking for a change in another MO, which had
correct on number 1, correct. And there was the same thing. We asked if anybody had an objection to that and wanted to change their number because of that, and nobody said anything. So if they do, we can go back and revisit it and take a roll call.
Well, I do.
Okay.
So, yes,
all right. Why don't we take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll tackle that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Christy. I just wanted to make sure you can hear me. So we're ready to jump
I
in.
can hear you, Tori.
Perfect.
Tori, do you want to take over the presentation and present?
You know, Ibrahim, what I want to do really quickly is I want to address Peter's question about the SMCs, only knowing that we have to have finalization on those SMCs as we come out of this to make our deadline with presenting information in front of the board.
Okay.
So I just want to address what it is really quickly. And then Tori and I have been communicating about time.
Oh, what's the question? Sorry.
So he just wanted to go back to the lowering of groundwater levels component, that if the measurable objective is changed as well to the average of spring, that
Yes.
he has a comment about that.
Okay.
So we'll just wait a moment here for folks to come back. Sarah, thank you for that clarification from you in the chat that aligns with your level of agreement on SMC 5. So if we just check in with, make sure that Brenna and Val are both back. Brenna, Val, you can either pop your cameras on or you can just say in the chat that you're back. Or you can unmute and say it. So to make sure everybody's back. Marina, as we wait for everybody to come back, I also want it to be reflected. When we took roll call, Sarah wasn't with us quite yet, but she joined us shortly thereafter. So if we could, I don't think that she missed anything. She had already previewed the minutes beforehand, so she knew about those. So I don't think that she missed anything. I feel confident that we could mark her as present.
Sounds good.
I'm back. Did you hear me?
Yeah, thank you, Val. Thanks, Brenna. All right. Okay, so Peter, to your point about revisiting SMC 1, the chronic lowering of groundwater levels with that average spring, you wanted to say something? Oh, you're on mute, Peter.
It was just unclear to me, and this really probably question goes to Pat. As I understood, we wanted to vote on that, changing that to average spring groundwater elevation as being the measurable objective.
And I think that the fact that we don't vote, we can do a call for redoing a roll call based on that if anybody has an objection to it. So we won't go to the task of doing a full roll call unless somebody has an objection. If one person does, we'll revisit.
Yeah. Okay. Objection to the change. Is that what
correct?
Gotcha. Okay.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for the clarification.
Sure, you bet. I know it's a lot of numbers and a lot of things, but I think this gives a truer sense of the discussion at hand.
Yeah, it's just the procedural things. Thank you.
Sure, sure.
All right, thank you.
Everybody gets PhDs in communication theory and how to do gradient scale.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, and Ibrahim, I believe that we've recorded everyone as well as commentary and discussion points in association with number 5. So it looks like we have the opportunity to go ahead and move on to Tori's presentation about projects and management actions.
Okay, Tori, I'm going to stop sharing. It's all yours.
Oh, Ibrahim, if you don't mind sharing and I can just direct you through, that might be quicker.
Okay.
Is that okay? All right, well, while we find my slide, there we go. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tori Klug. I'm an environmental engineer based in Stantec's Pasadena office. I'm actually from a little closer to Lake County up in Benicia, California. And I've been kind of in the background of the GSP development process thus far and have been queued up to help with the projects and management actions. And I'm excited to present them to you here today. I'll try to go quick because I know we all have a cutoff at 1:30, but we're packing in a lot of information. So if it seems like I am not going into as much detail, it's because I am, and I encourage everyone to check out the draft section for more information. So to start, I wanted to kind of focus us in on the purpose of projects and management actions. They're overall to support the GSA in achieving its sustainability goal, and the Big Valley Basin sustainability goal is listed there. And another way to frame it is to also to help avoid undesirable results over the GSP planning and implementation horizon. So that's for the next several decades. And the way I like to frame it is that it's kind of the more tangible and forward-thinking part of the SGMA process. We've been thinking a lot about the data, about setting the basin conditions. Now we get to think about projects and management actions, or PMA, that we can take to improve our understanding of the basin and to improve management of the basin. Next slide, please. There we go. So I wanted to give a quick overview of the process that we've taken. A lot of you are familiar with it because you are engaged in key parts of it. There are kind of three pathways by which we identified potential projects and management actions. One is GSPAC input. And a few weeks ago, about a month ago, we asked for everyone to provide input through a table with varying amounts of detail. And we got a lot of really useful ideas. We really appreciate everyone's time and thought in generating those ideas. And we also paired those up with reference reports that have kind of played a key role in the development of the GSP thus far, including things kind of specific to a particular project like the Adobe Creek conjunctive use feasibility study, and then some more broad reports like the Adobe Creek climate adaptation plan that had a few different ideas that were brought into projects and management actions. Then we also reflected on data gaps that had been previously identified and how we could potentially fill them in implementing projects and management actions. And all of that is obviously focused on achieving groundwater sustainability. So let's see. We had a lot of ideas submitted by the GSPAC, and then kind of through reflection of the technical team and from reports that we referenced. And a lot of those ideas were related. So some of the projects and management actions that you'll see in the section and presented here today are kind of an amalgam or a combination of different PMA. And then we also wanted to have a kind of organization structure for all of the PMA that were identified for inclusion in the GSP to understand kind of what the GSA is committing to versus where there's a little more flexibility depending on resource availability, depending on buy-in of different stakeholders. And so we developed this tiering structure that all of the PMA are sorted into. There's tier 1, which are projects and management actions that the GSA would be the lead on. Those are planned for implementation or will be implemented. And the purpose is either to reach sustainability or to otherwise comply with SGMA and support GSA operations. Tier 2 is projects that could be implemented by the GSA or a stakeholder. And they may be implemented depending on resource availability, and they would improve management and help work towards achieving measurable objectives. And then tier 3 are projects that would be implemented by stakeholders with perhaps GSA coordination. And they, again, are dependent on resource availability, and they might be outside of the purview of the GSA, but would support wider management in the basin. Then the last line there is adaptive management, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end, which is really what happens if a measurable threshold is approached or exceeded, or if there are drought conditions, how does the GSA react to that? And overall, I want to emphasize that the tier 1 PMA are ones that the GSA would need to find resources to implement. So either through implementation fees that Eddie brought up earlier today, or through attaining funding from different sources. So we were thoughtful about what ended up in tier 1, since that's kind of that has funding implications. Next slide, please. So in addition to the tiers, the PMA were sorted into 5 different categories to kind of give a quick flavor of the type of activities that would be carried out. And those are shown here. The majority of the PMA identified are related to monitoring and data management. And that kind of drives home the point that a lot of these actions are to help the GSA have better information to make informed groundwater management decisions. Next slide, please. So to go through some of the Tier 1B PMA, the majority of these at the Tier 1 level focus on monitoring data management, 5 of the 7. And the first one is focused
sorry,
on...
Tori, where is Tier 1A?
Oh, thank you for that question, Ibrahim. So Tier 1A, as identified in a few slides back, is focused on reaching sustainability. And given that there are not recognized drastically poor conditions in the basin, we haven't identified any Tier 1A PMA. So the highest tier that we have projects and management actions for is Tier 1B, which is focused on generally improving conditions, improving our understanding of basin conditions, especially, and expanding the monitoring data network, and being also really prepared for kind of GSA action if things were to get worse. And I'll talk about that with the domestic well management program in a moment. Does that answer your question, Ibrahim?
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. So Tier 1B, the first one we have is expanding the well monitoring network. This would be with a few multi-completion wells. We actually have a technical support services application in development with DWR right now to install one of those that would kind of ease the cost burden on the GSA and help augment the available data into the future. The next one is kind of a suite of activities to improve understanding of relationships between surface water and groundwater. That could include installation of shallow monitoring wells. There are some specific and stream gauges as well. And there are some specific potential locations mentioned in the draft text that I encourage you all to check out. And then that could also include expanding the frequency of groundwater elevation data, such that there's a higher temporal resolution or more frequent groundwater elevation data, so you can really get into shorter term fluctuations in that relationship. Another one is conducting a basin-wide water quality survey. So there are a few questions earlier about groundwater quality data, and this would be a kind of a 2-year baseline condition that this activity would allow us to define. And all of these are kind of interrelated with refinements to the Big Valley integrated hydrologic model. So a lot of the data that would be generated in the other projects and management actions would be incorporated to improve how the model represents basin conditions. Next slide. One up, please, Ibrahim. So I mentioned before a well management program, and this was something that was discussed earlier, and Eddie and Ibrahim mentioned it. There's obviously a lack of comprehensive understanding of where domestic wells are in the basin, and also the screening intervals that they have. And so one of the key goals of this project is to compile additional information to what's available through the DWR well completion reports and other sources to better understand where domestic wells are and which might be most vulnerable to changing groundwater conditions. And paired with that is a lot of education and outreach to help people get connected with potential resources to mitigate domestic well impacts. Also coordination with DWR's dry well reporting system, and a well impacts mitigation program that connects to adaptive management, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes. And then the last two here focus on education and outreach, and the GSA website would also kind of interrelate with the well management program and be a key way to communicate with folks about groundwater conditions and how they might impact beneficial uses and users of groundwater in the basin. The next three are under Tier 2. So these are projects that may be implemented by the GSA or stakeholder-led, and they would be implemented if resources are available and would hopefully help support the GSA in reaching measurable objectives. These three focus on water supply augmentation or specifically on recharge. The first two are specific projects that have been identified for a while that could be implemented. And then the last one is kind of a larger, wider look at recharge potential locations and benefits of implementing recharge projects at those locations. And those could be kind of at a larger scale, or they could also be smaller scale with swales or small ponds. And also we received some feedback from a GSPAC member that it could also take into account cover crop and tillage practices to improve recharge across the basin. Next slide, please. So the rest of the Tier 2 projects and management actions are represented here. One thing that we received a lot of feedback about is the water demand estimates that were used in the model. And so the first one here is to improve or refine those water demand estimates to be more locally specific. Another is to explore the potential for in lieu use of surface water for frost control, and that would be in the form of perhaps like retention basins that folks could access instead of pumping groundwater for frost protection. And then the last one is to improve our understanding of the groundwater quality RMS wells or representative monitoring site wells by conducting video surveys that would allow for more information about the screening intervals and the well construction information. And then the last tier is Tier 3 here. And these are, again, projects and management actions that might be outside of the purview of the GSA, but that could improve management. And these include reestablishing wetlands and riparian habitats, coordination with hitch passage and spawning data, and kind of connecting that to the data that are generated through some of the previous PMA. And then also conducting an alternative analysis study on frost protection methods. And lastly, implementing a non-point source discharge control program. And like I mentioned, some of these would support and improve water management in the basin, but might be outside of the purview of the GSA and thus are in Tier 3 here. Next slide, please. So I know we're almost to the end here, but I want to quickly touch on adaptive management. It's one of the most important parts of this section, I think. We outlined two different sets of sustainability triggers. One is long-term basin sustainability triggers that would be either a negative trend causing a sustainability indicator to approach a minimum threshold, or a minimum threshold already being exceeded, and that would set into action a set of activities. And then there's short-term acute drought triggers that would occur either during an extended drought period or when a drought emergency is declared. And Ibrahim, if you can go to the next slide. Basically, there would be a suite of actions triggered by those triggers that would include notifying the GSPAC, coordination with the Office of Emergency Services at the county to help mitigate against impacts to domestic wells. And there would be a larger look at whether or not conditions are localized or regional. And that would determine the GSA's potential reactions or implementation of corrective actions. And so if they're isolated, it might be focused on helping, say, specific domestic well owners with avoiding impacts to their use of water, or for wider regional changes that might bring about kind of increased monitoring frequency to understand exactly what's happening, potential management modifications, and that could include pumping restrictions or implementation of one of the other projects or management actions that would also help with the negative trend. So that was very quick. I'm sure some of you have questions, and I'm grateful to take them if we have time. Otherwise, I really hope that everyone will take some time to review the draft text and provide feedback through that.
Heroic express version of that, Tori. Thank you.
Yeah,
How to condense 30 into
speedy.
15. And really what this is meant to do is to provide a little guidance and a little opportunity pre-review. You have until October 29th. The GSPAC has to review this information. But are there any immediate questions that anybody has? And we're still going to take time for any public comments that there might be as well. So we're going to run a little bit over here, but try to. Any questions, comments, clarifications needed on that? Sarah?
Yeah, I'm sorry, you might have said it and I missed it, but how did the projects get moved into the tiers? Versus, why is something a tier 1?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question, Sarah. So I guess I'll maybe start from tier 3. So there's some recognition that a few of the ideas that were submitted or in reports are kind of based on identified data gaps that were outside of the purview of the GSA, and thus the GSA couldn't say that they would be a lead entity on them. So that's a lot of the tier 3 projects. And then tier 2 are projects that might not be required to comply with SGMA or to support GSA operations, but that would improve management and that the basin and beneficial users and uses of groundwater in the basin would benefit from. And then the ones that were kind of recognized as necessary to comply with SGMA. So those are a lot of the data gaps filling, better defining the interconnection between surface water and groundwater, expanding the well monitoring network. Those all fell into tier 1. And there's some recognition that the that tier 1 was somewhat restricted by available funding, that the GSA couldn't commit to doing everything under the potential umbrella of their purview, because then they would be kind of accountable for leveraging high GSP implementation fees. But we welcome feedback on specific tiering and on the criteria as well.
David or Sky, did you have a question, comment?
Okay. Yeah, this is Sky. So under, what are we calling it, tier 1B, I see that there's a cost estimate for $420,000 to install new monitoring wells, I think is my understanding of this. And I just want to say that I would be very uncomfortable recommending this expenditure, to be put onto the residents of the basin. I have to be really convinced that we need new wells. We've already got more wells than we can monitor. I can't see that. People may not know, we're looking at a fire tax of $175 per parcel being proposed. There's a tremendous amount of people that these kind of costs are going to not sit well with them. So I'd have to see distinct benefit to recommend these costs. I would say take that out right off the bat. And then down under deep well or developed well management program, the domestic well inventory, I think there's going to be tremendous pushback from residents over that. The other things you mentioned there, I don't know how much pushback there'd be, probably a good thing, but trying to inventory every domestic well, I think it's a waste of money. Personally, I'd have to be convinced of why that was a wise expenditure. We need small government and small spending on this. So if there's not definite benefit, I don't think we should make the expenditure or recommend the expenditure.
I'm going to jump in real quick here. just to go back and address the first question, Sky, about the monitoring wells. So that came out of some previous conversations where we realized, we've made some oversimplifications. We have more than one aquifer system. So the thought was, could we better understand the different aquifer systems? Well, for us to do that, we need sort of a dedicated monitoring network. So that's the main purpose of that cost estimate. And then your other comment on the domestic well inventory analysis, I mean, that's kind of counterintuitive to some of the direction we've received from some of the GSPAC members. One of the main reasons we want to do that is to get a sense of where the domestic wells are, what the depth of those wells are, how many of those wells are dry, how many are experiencing, different types of issues. So I think that's really, really important in this basin. But if folks have a different opinion, then we should pull it. But I think that's probably one of the most important PMAs, is to really understand where these domestic wells are, what their age is, their depths, all that kind of information. So that's two sort of responses I had on that.
Thanks, Eddie. Can I add on to that?
Sure,
I know we're short on time or over time. I also want to highlight that the $420,000 is for 4 multi-completion wells. It's kind of the ideal. And there's also already a application in for technical support services from DWR that would take care of one of those wells, and we might be able to find additional funding for the rest of those. And so there's the potential for other funding sources than implementation fees, and then also the potential to, if that is seen as too high of a cost, if there aren't other funding sources, to think critically about how many we need.
Yeah, or Tori, to middle ground, can we move that to tier 2, which be places that the GSA will try to implement if resource is available. So which will not be a strong commitment for it being in 1B. That's another compromise.
Yeah, the way that the section is written right now is that it would be like up to 4 wells, that the ideal would be 1 per quadrant. So we're not committing to 4. Maybe that cost estimate in this table should say up to $420,000. So I'm sorry if that number off the bat gave anyone a fright. But the language in the draft section is more particular. And then I also, on the well management program, there are a number of efforts have been done statewide to better understand where domestic wells might potentially be by comparing census data and parcel data. There's a really useful tool from the Community Water Center that has that information, or the results of that analysis, at a statewide level. And one of the activities that we outline under that management action would be to refine that analysis at a local level, and then where possible to fill information in with well completion reports. I know that there might be challenges there, but we're trying to build out as refined of information as possible so that we can communicate with well owners and users that might be vulnerable to changes in groundwater conditions.
Pat, thank you for being patient. I'll also, as Pat comes on here, I'll direct everybody. Sarah made a comment in the chat in regards to the importance of the domestic well inventory. So thanks, Sarah. Pat, go ahead. Thank you for being patient.
I'm curious and really surprised on the $105,000 per monitoring well cost. How is that even possible?
Triple, yeah. So it's one borehole that, say we drill it to, let's go 500 feet, and then within that one borehole, you'd have 3 individual monitoring wells. So it's been about $120,000 sort of for a 1 multi-completion monitoring well. That's kind of what we've been paying. So. Yeah. If you got a cheaper driller, let us know. So. There's some testing also. We run e-log, some geophysical logs. So there's a little more investigation sort of and data collected during these sort of test holes than versus sort of a domestic well or an ag well.
So I know as people digest the last parts of the projects and management action, I absolutely want to make sure that we get in any public comment that there might be from anybody who has joined us. Thank you to our GSPAC members who have been gracious with their time and staying a little over here. Are there any public comments from anybody who's joined us today? if you wouldn't mind, Ibrahim, advancing the slide to the public comment period, because that has our email address on it. And we are always taking information, input, suggestions, feedback, recipes, all kinds of things that bring us water, all those types of things. Anything that you might think to send that is related to the GSP, please do use that email. We get it immediately and it's filtered out to the team appropriately. So, Pat, did you have a further question? Oh, you're on mute, Pat.
Sorry.
No worries.
Run one real quick question that maybe Marina can answer, just in regards to the Highland Springs Reservoir right now. Is there still water behind the dam that could be released? And how much, what's the storage right now in there?
Yeah, so there's still water behind the Highland Springs Reservoir. Again, we haven't been operating it. The water that is flowing out of it is because the gate is currently, it's unoperable. We're in the process of coming up with a plan. We can't operate it. We can't close it all the way. We have it closed as much as possible. So all the water that is flowing out, we are in the process of trying to identify the flow that is coming out of it. But there is still water behind that structure, Pat.
Do we have any idea how much water?
No, we're in the process of trying to document that. We're routinely out there trying to take measurements, get a better idea of how much is coming out. But that's something that once I figure that out, I can go ahead and report back to the group.
Yeah, I'm just curious, in a year like this, a drought year, could we, during hitch spawning season, could we just be opening that up a little bit more, and would there still be water at the end of the year?
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry to get sidetracked.
Nope, you're okay. Thank you.
Right. Any other comments, questions? I do want to note one thing before Marina officially ushers us out of here, and that is that the December GSPAC meeting has to be altered based on our timing with the release of the public draft to give everybody enough time to review it and to respond to it. So I'm popping into the chat here. December 17th is our date that we polled everybody, and that's when the most people can make it, from 11 a.m. to 1:30. So our standing regular time, but December 17th, and that'll be also put up on the website too, so that people know about that. All right. Well, again, thank you, GSPAC members, for staying a little long here. Always appreciate your time, effort, and energy, and it's kind of marvelous how much everybody has done to this point. So, Marina, anything else?
Nope, that's it. Just echoing what Christy said. Thank you all for your participation today. We will see you December 17th. If you want to catch up on any previous GSPAC meetings, you can find that information on the Water Resources website. But with that further ado, I think everyone's tummies are rumbling. So let's go ahead and adjourn at 1:43. Thank you all.
And just point of clarification really quickly, in November, we have a meeting too. It's on the 19th. So we will see
Thanks,
everybody
Christy.
then.
This is why we had it.